Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. I have as my special guest today, Ken Daniels. Welcome, Ken.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
I need to make a special announcement today. As you see from the banner, this video, this stream is dedicated in the memory of Vonric Soulstrider. Vonric Soulstrider has been a longtime supporter of this channel. And I received word from his partner that he died quite suddenly this week, that he fell. And so Vonric is no longer with us. And this stream is dedicated to him. Vonric, we salute you. So with that, Ken, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Ken Daniels has written a book called Why I Believed, and it tells his story about how he well, I'll let him tell his story for you, but you're just going to get a taste of it here. And if you want a more detailed description of it and a more detailed in-depth look at Ken's life, a link to the book is in the description. And Ken, you told me that there's more than one version of the book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yes, the link that you provided in your YouTube channel points to an Amazon page that has a cover like this. That was the original cover that I published under a smaller outfit before I went onto Amazon. So somehow this just recently got changed to this cover. The cover that I subsequently used after the first cover was this one, Why I Believed, Reflections of a Former Missionary. And so you'll see probably both on Amazon, but for some reason they made this one like 3 times the price of this one. It's really the same book. So if you see this one and it's cheaper, just go ahead and get that one.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's start into your story. You used to be a missionary. That's really something, to go from missionary to atheist. Was it a long journey, or was it something that happened fairly quickly?
It was pretty long and convoluted, I have to say, and painful.
Okay. Let's back up and we'll start with how you got into Christianity in the first place.
So yes, my parents met in Ethiopia. They were both missionaries with an evangelical outfit called SIM, which used to be called Sudan Interior Mission. But my mother was a nurse, and she traveled as a single missionary throughout the mountains of Ethiopia on a donkey, and she would go from village to village and treat the Ethiopian people. And my father was a builder, so he was a building construction engineer, and he oversaw building projects for the mission. For example, Bible schools, hospitals, churches, things like that. So they met, and I was born there in Ethiopia, in the capital. And we left when I was 6. My mother had some health issues, and we went back to Arkansas. Well, I should say when I was 4 years old. That was, as an evangelical, those of you who are evangelicals know that it's good to be able to point back to a specific time in your life, or a moment in your life when you invited Jesus into your heart as your personal savior. And for me, that was when I was 4. Don't ask me how I was able to discern all the nuances between the pros and cons of Christianity at that point. But I did trustingly accept Jesus as my savior. And I would say that my life obviously didn't change all that much. I was never a terrible kid, and I never was a perfect kid, but somewhere in between. But when I was later on, when I was at the age of 13, I was back this time now, not in Ethiopia, but in Nigeria. So I was in Nigeria till I was 16. My parents had an assignment there. My father remained a builder, my mother a nurse, and I was at a boarding school in Ethiopia. And I had a teacher that I highly respected, a 6th grade teacher. And he was very dedicated, very kind, very loving person. I really looked up to him. And he talked about reaching out to God and praying to God, and pouring out our hearts to him on a daily basis, continual basis. And so I adopted that practice at that point. And I felt sometimes there was a flood of emotions that would pour through me as I poured out my soul to God. And And I felt like I was connected to the
Mhm.
creator of the universe who loved me and
Mhm.
who saved me from my sin. And so it was at that point that I became very strongly um, motivated to you know, share my faith with others, and I was constantly looking for ways to share my faith. And I think,
Was this
go ahead.
was this a school for missionary kids?
It was yes, but it was in Nigeria, and so there were people around about that uh, had various understandings of or non-understandings of the gospel. Um,
Mhm.
but even in the school, there were non-Christians that would come in for expatriates, like European parents would sometimes drop off their kids there just to get an education. They might be working
Oh,
in Nigeria for a bottling company or a cement manufacturing company or whatever. They would drop off their kids there, and we would have interactions with these kids. So it was a good melting pot.
were the students from a lot of different countries?
Yes, there was a mix of Nigerians and as well as Europeans and Americans. That was the primary mix. So
Was English the primary language at
it
the
was,
school?
it was, yes. Mhm. Yeah, so I had Polish friends, I had Korean friends, I had you name it. They were from all over. So yeah, but I was always looking for ways to share my faith and to just um, be a part of the great mission that God had called me to. So continuing on from there, I did have a little bit of, I think, in retrospect, maybe an issue with judging. So I I tended to see those who didn't follow God in the way that I thought they should to be, somehow deficient. And so,
Mhm.
so if they listened to the wrong kind of music or, didn't, wore the wrong type of clothes, it was too revealing or what, So I was always just kind of always, at least in my mind, if not outwardly, I was always judging. I think I had a fight with my sister one time when she was driving and she was playing some secular rock music or whatever, and I turned it off, and she turned it back on, and I turned it off. I said, "No, you're not going to listen to this while I'm in the car with you." So,
Was she
but
older?
no, she was a couple years younger. So,
Mm.
but yeah, so I became a little bit squeaky clean type goody two shoes in some senses, but. Um, but I understood that my personal relationship with Christ was what, or his action on my behalf was what saved me, not anything that I did for myself. So I had a very Protestant slash evangelical understanding of salvation in my relationship.
What what denomination, if any, did you belong to at that time?
So my father came from the Northwest. He grew up in Oregon for the most part, and the denomination he belonged to was called Conservative Baptist denomination.
Okay.
And it's more local to up in that region primarily, but it's similar to um, uh, just a vanilla evangelical, conservative evangelical, non-denominational type movement. My mother grew up in an independent fundamental Baptist background in Texas.
Oh, brother.
Yes, so when she was 9 years old, she went forward at a revival, church revival or whatever, and dedicated her life and she to God, and she pledged three promises. One, that she would never drink alcohol. So I never knew her to take even so much as uh, Nyquil, because Nyquil had alcohol in it. So
Mhm.
in her life, she would
Mhm.
never touch alcohol. Number two, she would never go to the movies. And
Mhm.
number three, she would dedicate her life to become a missionary for the Lord. So that's how she ended up in Ethiopia on a donkey going from village to village. And she was the most selfless person I ever knew. I mean, she died in '98 and at the age of 63 for cancer. Uh, so I have nothing but high praise for her and her dedication to serving humanity, serving the Lord in the way that she knew best.
Yeah, the thing with the movies reminds me of when I was in college. That was a really big deal, and it wasn't all movies, it was just R-rated movies.
Uh,
We were a little bit more liberal.
yeah,
And, but anyone who was a believer should never watch an R-rated movie.
right, right.
And then Schindler's List came out,
Okay, yeah.
and there was also another one, the one about um, Billy, I can't remember his name. He was a nasty guy turned preacher, and that was also an R-rated movie. And
Thornton or
I can't remember now, but anyway, people rethought that. Okay, I guess there are some R-rated movies that it's okay for a Christian to see.
yeah. Well, interesting. I mean, I've always been very conservative, and even, I mean, I'm jumping forward because I haven't got to the point where I deconverted yet. But even after deconverting, a lot of the Christian ethics and morality that I had lived all my life, I retained. I've never kissed romantically anybody but my wife in my entire life, and and I'm squeamish when if I'm presented with a chance to watch certain types of movies that I just have no interest in because they make me uncomfortable. And so I could probably fit in back into the Christian church very, very quickly and easily.
I have a similar story. I also, in my lifetime, I have only had one sex partner, and
Unusual.
yeah, yeah, and people, when I tell people that my life changed very little, the only things that changed is I no longer read my Bible, I no longer pray before I eat or have a prayer time in the morning, and I no longer go to church, and that's it. Those are the only things
Yeah,
that
very
change.
similar for me. And although I do go to church maybe once a month or so, just to kind of um, have a social life with my wife, meet up with other people that she in her circle and such. She's still a believer, obviously, but yeah, it's a fine line to walk.
Hmm. So go ahead with your story. You at this point.
So yeah, and I read as a part of my devotion to Christ. It was continual prayer as well as Bible reading every day and studying the Bible. And when I got to be, I guess I was a freshman in college, around age 18.
Hmm.
I went to Laterno University, or college at the time, which is a Christian, evangelical Christian college, mostly a technical school. I went there to study computer science and engineering
Where's that located?
in Longview, Texas, East Texas.
Okay.
So um, my I was interested by that point already in joining missions, and my parents had served in a particular mission, but I gained an interest in another mission organization called Wycliffe Bible Translators,
Hmm.
because the thought of being able to take the gospel to people who had never heard it before, maybe their language had never even been written down, let alone did they have a Bible or a New Testament in their language. So it intrigued me to be able to play a role as being one of God's foot soldiers to go to a place that was least touched by the gospel. And so I wanted to decide, well, do I go to Bible college or do I go to I liked computers, and so I decided to go to Laterno University because they had a computer science and engineering degree there. And my mother had encouraged me along those lines. She said, well, she knew a lot of people that had gone into missions and had studied the Bible and nothing else, and then they left the missions for one reason or another. It's common for people for one reason or another to have to leave the mission field. And then what do you do when you leave? You're stuck without any trade or skill that you can apply for making a living. So she encouraged me to go to a Christian university and study uh, a discipline that would allow me to fall back on that discipline if I were to leave the mission field. And so that was very prescient on her part. I appreciated her advice, and so to this day, after we left the field, to this day, I've been working as a in the computer science field. So I'm
Did
happy.
you ever meet a couple, Paul and Barb Thomas?
Yes, yes. I don't know them well, but I do know them somewhat. My kids watered their flowers at one point for.
Oh, okay. I was supporters of theirs for many years.
Oh, really? Small world.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I went to Laterno, and while I was there, I would read through the Bible. I, I I used a cassette tape. I had a Bible on tape, and I would put my headphones on, and I had a notebook, and I would just start in the Old Testament and read all the way through, and then I would take notes as I was listening to and read and following through in the Bible. But then there were these things that started popping out at me. It's like, really, it's like, if Moses was telling the people that he was the soldiers, they could go in and they should kill all the men, women, and children, but if there were virgins, they could take them for themselves. And it's like, well, what distinguishes the virgins from everybody else? What makes them so special that you should be able to take them? And then it started to dawn on me. It's like, maybe these people weren't really that upstanding after all. And it sounded like, and God was, Moses was speaking for God in this context. So you couldn't say, well, this is just what the people decided to do. No, this is what, God
told him to do.
Saying through Moses. Yes.
And you're still an undergrad at this point?
Yeah, I was 18 and, as a freshman. And so I went through most of the Bible and wrote all of the notes, all of the doubts that I had that kept popping up, just things that bothered me. And so I wrote to, I was an avid reader of Christianity Today magazine, which was a, evangelical publication, flagship evangelical publication started by Billy Graham. And I wrote to them, wrote to the editorialists and said, hey, I'm struggling with my faith. I've got these issues that I'm writing them down. I'm struggling with them. What do I do? And they wrote back to me, and somehow something they said kind of helped me back to help me sweep things under the rug. It talked about taking things so literally and being wooden and not, standard things that people say to kind of take you off the trail of really pursuing these problems, these little gnats, kind of swatting these gnats away. And it didn't hurt that I met a girl at the time who was a Christian and started dating her. And so I think that sometimes social things actually have a stronger impact than intellectual things in our lives. And so I was able to, long story short, I was able to retain my faith for probably, so that was when I was a freshman. I kind of doubted off and on a little bit until my senior year. And that's when I kind of got back on board fully. I served at LeTourneau University as the, not the chaplain, but it's called the VP of Ministries. So I organized mission trips. I organized cleaning up the neighborhood programs, other type, worship services, things like that. I led people in prayer and in Bible reading and that sort of thing. So I was very involved as a senior in college. I had somehow swept these doubts under the rug. Then I went to seminary at Columbia Biblical Seminary in South Carolina, a very conservative evangelical seminary, very mission-minded. I got a one-year graduate degree in biblical studies. They had a certificate program. It was a one-year program. So I got that under my belt, and then shortly after that, I met my wife Charlene at a church where my parents were attending in North Carolina, near Charlotte.
Were your parents back from the mission field at this point?
They were, yes.
Were they retired, or were they?
No, they were working stateside at the home office. My father was assigned to work on the construction of the headquarters there. They had relocated to from New Jersey. And so my mother continues to serve as a nurse. Unbeknownst to me at that time, she was dealing with cancer. She didn't tell us for like 9 years until it became such that she couldn't hide it anymore. So went to Columbia Biblical Seminary. That helped me solidify my faith. Although I did have, I had questions, and I asked my professors questions, and they were able to kind of help me through things. Then I met Charlene, my wife, right after that seminary year, and we started plans for joining Wycliffe and going to the field. And we ended up we wanted to go to a place not like where a lot of missionaries congregate. They tend to go to places that are have a better climate or better amenities. Places like Nairobi or maybe Alaska, or not that has a great climate, but a lot of people feel per capita there's more missionaries in Alaska than anywhere else in the world.
Oh, really?
But I wanted to.
I would have guessed Japan.
I'm not sure about that, but anyway, so that was my understanding anyway. So I decided to go. Let's find a place where the fewest Christians reside of any place in the world where we're still allowed to go. So I found that Niger, the country of Niger, or some people say Niger, in sub-Saharan Africa, just north of Nigeria and south of Algeria, mostly in straddles across the southern half of the Sahara Desert, and only 1/10 of 1% of the people there at the time were Christians, and most of them are Muslims, some animists and such. But we found a people group that had about 500,000 people that had no written language, no New Testament, no Bible in their language, and were.
Bef-
Go ahead.
Before you get into your mission work, I'd like to go back to your seminary time.
Yes,
I know that have you seen the video by that was made by Sunday School by Satan, or it's Satan leading a Sunday school. It's an animated video. Have you seen that?
I haven't. Is that sort of like screw tape letters or?
It's made by an atheist,
Oh, okay.
and it's the premise of the story is they asked Satan to lead this Sunday school class, not realizing that it was Satan.
Uh,
And Satan teaches all the kids things that pastors learn in seminary, but they will never tell you.
uh,
Um, and all the kids are just flabbergasted that, and our pastor knows this stuff. Yeah, he knows this stuff.
you mean like
It-
Paul didn't write second? I mean, Peter didn't write Second Peter.
exactly,
Didn't write Second
exactly.
Peter, but yeah,
Yes,
that's
exactly those kinds of
yeah.
things. And I'm curious, at the seminary that you went to, did they teach some of those things? Did they gloss over them, or
It's
how did
a,
they handle things like that?
it's a good question. I know Bart Ehrman is big on that, and he talks about most mainline seminaries do teach you those types of things. Seminary I went to, there were mentions of, like, some people don't think that Peter wrote Second Peter, but here's why we think he did. Type.
Ah, okay. Okay.
So there was never. I mean, it was quite conservative, so they toe the line basically. So I was
Okay.
only tangentially aware of some of these issues.
Dorimo 10 has given us the name. The name of the video is Satan's Guide to the Bible.
Uh,
It is well worth seeing. This guy spent a couple of years putting this together, and it's animated and it's really well done.
right, right. I mean, I didn't realize until probably after my deconversion that a number of the Pauline epistles are in dispute in terms of the author. That Paul didn't. Most mainstream scholars think that Paul wrote only 6 of the epistles attributed to him.
I had no idea of that either. I also had no idea that the authors of the Gospels were not,
Yeah, yeah. No, that I didn't know
Matthew,
either.
Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah, that I didn't know either. I went through seminary and I didn't know that. Nobody ever
Oh,
mentioned
wow.
it. So,
Wow.
so yeah, that's the level of education you get in an evangelical institution sometimes. Maybe if I had gone on longer, I was only in 1 year, maybe I would have been taught, but I kind of doubt it.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Okay, so you go to the mission field with your wife, and your work is to I imagine that your first work is to try to turn the local language into a written language.
right. So I will say that we only ended up there in Niger or Niger for 3 years, so we didn't get nearly as much accomplished as we had set out to do. And normally, the plan was to translate. Wycliffe is mostly focused on New Testaments, just because. I mean, most evangelicals will say the whole Bible is equally inspired, but I think in practice, the New Testament is seen as a step above, or at least it's shorter, so it's more manageable to be able to actually get it done. So that's
Well, plus if you read the New Testament, you've got enough theology to believe in Christianity, but if you read the Old Testament, you don't.
right, exactly. So the focus of Wycliffe is primarily on the New Testament for practical and maybe theological reasons as well. But so that was our plan. That usually takes most missionaries who take that route. It's a 25-year process. It's a whole career, basically.
Mhm.
Do all the training and then get out there. We did a fair bit of training. We took 4 semesters of graduate linguistics to get prepared for how do you break down a language? How do you learn a language that hasn't been written? How do you transcribe it? How do you develop an orthography, the writing system? How do you study the grammar so that you can or even make a dictionary and then say the grammar, so you can kind of put it all together and translate the Bible or the New Testament into that language. So we had a lot of training going in, put a lot of investment into that, time and money. We were not paid by any organization to do the work we were doing. We were responsible for going out to church,
raising your support,
and individuals, and raising that support. And so we had to get a certain amount of monthly commitment before we could even set foot outside the U.S. But our first stop actually was in Belgium, because in Niger the official language is French, even though only 10% of the people speak it. But that's the language of kind of the official education and government, police, and all that. Everything official that you need to deal with is in French.
Parlez-vous français?
Oui, toujours. So we studied French for a year and a half in Europe. We bounced around from Belgium to France, where our second child was born, our son. So we had our first son 6 months before we left to go to Belgium, and then we had a 2-month stop in France, and that's where our second son was born. And then our daughter was born later. I'll get to that in a minute. But so we went straight from, and we were also in Switzerland. So I said Belgium, France, and French-speaking Switzerland. So we went straight from Switzerland then down to Africa. We had a 3-month training program there for how to live in Africa. That was in Cameroon. And then we went to Niger in March of '97. March is the hottest season of the year, and it was brutally hot. Texas has nothing on Niger. We were 120 degrees or so routinely. But
I've heard stories from missionaries.
Yeah.
I heard a story from a missionary who went there, and they said that the day that they landed, it was 90 degrees, and they felt that they were sweltering, but all the people were wearing light jackets. And then a few days later, when it was 120, they understood why the people wore light jackets at 90.
Exactly. But it's a dry heat, right? Because it's the desert, so that's how you know around it. But so we ended up we were studying the language. We had a language assistant who would help us. We would make recordings, and we would do transcriptions and learn the language. And we had two little kids at the time to start with, and later we had our daughter in '98. So we actually ended up having 3 kids in diapers at the same time, and these were not these disposable diapers that people have in the West. These were cloth diapers that we had, and oftentimes we didn't have running water. We had a barrel that we would. So we had water maybe half the time, and so we'd fill up the barrel and had a little valve that would help us get water in the evenings. But we would swish the cloth diapers in the toilet and clean it up that way. So we had a lot of distractions. Just daily living was a chore, but it was all worth it in our minds because of
your souls.
Yeah, think about like the privilege and the honor it is to do the bidding of the Lord of the universe who created us. You can't surpass that in terms of your calling and your importance in the big picture of what's going on. So all of that paled in comparison to the privilege of doing what we were doing for God. So, but we ended up coming back for a furlough a little bit early. Normally you stay out there 3 years and you come back a year. We were out there for 2 years. My mom's health was declining rapidly, and we decided to come back. And we had more training to do as well, more of that linguistic training. Because we had done 2 semesters before we left, and then we had to do 2 more at some point. So we decided just to come back early. Came back early. I went to SIL, Summer Institute of Linguistics, which is the Wycliffe's training program in Dallas. And I had a good professor who taught about. He used mainstream scholars like George Lakoff, for example, eminent linguist, and he talked about tangentially. It wasn't the focus of the book that we were reading as a textbook, but it talked about evolution as if it were really a fact. I'd never really heard anybody talk about evolution as being a fact, and talked about
interesting.
Yeah, and Yeah, he talked about these ring species of salamander, for example, that they form a ring around the California Central Valley, and you have
Hmm.
or variety A, which can interbreed with variety B, and which can interbreed with variety C and D and so forth. But when you get all the way around to the other side, where A and F meet, A and F can't interbreed. It's like, okay, well, I mean, that sounds like there's some sort of, did God create each of those varieties separately, or why is it that A and F can't interbreed, whereas all the other ones in the chain can interbreed? So it lended a little bit of messiness to my view of the fixity of the species, I guess you could say. So that was a little chink in my armor.
Were you a young Earth creationist at this point?
So I grew up as a young Earth creationist, but by the time I got to college, even though it was a Christian college, I read enough books to know that that was a mistaken view of the world. That there's incredible amount of evidence, irrefutable evidence that the Earth is old. So yes, I was an old Earth creationist. Hugh Ross was an influence in me at that time, I would say.
Did you believe that there was a global flood?
No, I believed it was a local flood, but
Okay.
it was global in terms of what the people experienced, and to them it was global. Just
Hmm.
like to us, the sun rises, but it doesn't really rise. It's just it's an illusion. So they thought it was they perceived it as global because it flooded the whole region.
Hmm.
That was what I believed at the time. So,
What did you believe about Adam and Eve? Did you believe that they were literal people?
I did, but they were there were other humanoids around that didn't have souls. These were the first ones to have that God injected a soul to. There were other
Ah,
creatures that were like humans, but they didn't have souls like Adam and Eve did. So that was the way I kind of thought of it. So
but they were Homo sapiens.
physically, yes, but spiritually, no.
No. Okay.
Right.
Okay. I've always wondered how Christians reconcile that theologically, and I've seen a couple of people do it, but the few that I've seen have done it so badly that what they say doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And so I've been trying to find someone who actually had a theology that makes sense.
Yeah. I
But
mean, I would basically, I was adopted Hugh Ross's position. If you've heard of him, the author Hugh Ross.
I have, but I have not read him.
Right. So I didn't believe in an unbroken line of evolution from the lowest to the highest creatures. I believed that there was progressive creation where, in one era, God would create a certain number of creatures at a certain level, and then maybe in another era he would create another set and another set.
Mm. Mhm.
And the fact
Mhm.
that it seemed to indicate some sort of progression didn't bother me. I mean, I guess in retrospect it should have, but um, anyway, so that was the first chink in my armor, and um, it raised a whole slew of questions about, because before, when I had started doubting the Bible in college and writing down my questions about the nature of the Bible, I never once doubted God's existence. Up to this point, I had never doubted God's existence because I thought, well, how can you account for the diversity and the extreme um, uh, intricacy of life? You just
Mhm.
no way to do that outside of an agency that could create that could call that into existence. And so this was the first time I actually started to think, well, maybe there's, what if there's no God? And I reached out to my professor and had a conversation with him, and he was very kind and very gentle and helpful. He raised a question that I thought was telling. He said, "Why is it that only Westerners ask these types of questions?" It's like, um, it made me think that I'm infected by this Western disease of some sort, to be asking questions like this. And so I was put back in my place, I think, and um, enough to where we could go back from furlough and go back to Niger. By this point, in that year of furlough, that's when our daughter was born in North Carolina. And so we went back. We had 3 kids by now in the year 2000. Um, sorry, summer of '99, we went back, and we were there for one more year. Um, and during the course of that year, we had been in Niger, but we were sent to do some training in neighboring Burkina Faso, country of Burkina Faso. Capital is Ouagadougou. Love saying that name.
That's where Paul and Barb was in
Okay,
Burkina Faso.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we did some linguistic studies there, phonology workshops, and so forth. And while I was there, I was reading through the Old Testament. Things were bothering me again. I was the same kind of pattern as, you hear people try to sweep things under the rug, try to explain things away. But when you actually read it again, it's like it all came back welling up. And it's like I just don't understand how this can be the product of a divine being, a divine mind. And so then I reached out. By then, the internet was starting to come to Africa, and we had dial-up internet, and I was able to go to the library there at the center where we were at, and I searched. I mentioned my doubts to a colleague, and he said, "Well, have you looked at Clark Pinnock?" Clark Pinnock was a well-respected theologian.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he's alive anymore, but anyway, he was not like a Josh McDowell, which is kind of like a popular apologist or apologist, but he was kind of seen as a weighty apologist. So I Googled his name, and instead of anything by him coming up, what I found was a reference to his name in an online book called Beyond Born Again by Robert M. Price,
Mm-hmm.
and it was freely available. That was something I think that made a huge difference in my life, because this was the thing that this was my first introduction to anything from a liberal Christian perspective. He was a liberal Christian at the time. He's now an atheist, but if I read something from an atheist perspective, I think that would have been too big of a pill to swallow. But somebody who was questioning some of the traditional understandings of the Bible and just kind of validating the questions that I had and saying, yeah, I'm not off my rocker to think that these are problems. Other people think these are problems too. I don't have to suppress this. And so it was like a lightning bolt, a thunderbolt from the sky. It rocked my world. And there I was in Africa, supposed to be bringing the gospel and the Bible to the people of Africa, and I didn't even know what was up and what was down myself. How could I teach anybody else what to believe if I didn't even know myself what I believed?
Mm-hmm.
So I mentioned it to my wife, and she was devastated. I felt like I wasn't going to be one of those kinds who lives in the closet and just hides what I believe. I didn't want to be a hypocrite. And so then I also reached out to the director of the mission there in Niger, and they recommended that we go back to the U.S. for counseling. So ended up on a plane, came back to Dallas.
Did you come back alone, or your family came?
No, our whole family came back. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We were there for a week waiting for the plane, because the flights come only 1 week, and so during that week, I wrote down all my doubts, all my questions into a document. It's like a 25-page document.
How old were your children at this point?
So this was in 2000. So they would have been 2, 4, and 6.
Oh, so they were very young.
Yeah.
Okay. So then you come back to Dallas.
Yeah, I was speaking French to the kids, and they were learning French, and my wife was speaking English, and so we all came back to the U.S. and I was told I would needed to go and undergo counseling with a counselor with the mission. So that's why we ended up in Dallas, which is the headquarters of SIL, the organization that we were with. And so I had like 3 months of counseling, and at the beginning of that time, the counselor said, I want you to commit to reading only Christian books, no non-Christian books during the 3 months that we're together. And so I did. I kind of chafed at it, but at first, but then I did read. I read C.S. Lewis. I read Malcolm Muggeridge. I read what was his name? The guy from Twin Cities, Open Theism. I can't remember his name anymore. But that was the book. I should remember, because that was the book that kind of put me back into thinking that I could follow the faith again. It was a very sophisticated, nuanced version of Christianity. And
it wasn't John Piper, was it?
No. Gosh, I could have. I'll bring it up later if I can think of it. But anyway, so it was letters from an agnostic. Letters from an agnostic was a series of letters between him and his father, who was an agnostic. His father eventually came around, and there was some controversy around this author because he subscribes to open theism. He doesn't believe that God knows the future of what people are going to decide. Free people, like he didn't know that whether Abraham was going to follow through with the command to sacrifice his son or not. So God had to find out, right? So if God had
Jewel Swales?
No.
No. Okay.
But anyway, so that led me back to the faith for some time, and then, but I tell you, it was a roll. I haven't even told you all of the back and forth. I think if I were to count it up, there's at least a half a dozen back and forth. I lost my screen. Okay, can you, so at that point,
so you read that book, and you were feeling like you could continue with the mission work, and
yeah.
So did you go back to the field then at that point?
No, what happened was that in parallel, I read this book by a Christian author called Finding Darwin's God. You have to be a theistic evolutionist, Kenneth Miller.
Okay.
And I had never read anything remotely as convincing in favor of evolution as that book. And I just went down through the line. All the evidence pointing to evolution, it just seemed irrefutable. And so I adopted theistic evolution at the time. And I mentioned it to my counselor. I said, I'm back to believing, but I don't believe in a traditional creation. I believe in theistic evolution. And so they had a board that met, I think, to discuss our fate. And because of all my back and forth, and because of the instability that I demonstrated in my waffling, even though
I think it's amusing that a board would have to meet to decide whether your Christian faith was Christian enough.
Yeah.
How many points of theology can you disagree with us on and still represent us?
Yeah, to be fair, I don't know if it was really the theistic evolution that broke the camel's back, because I knew some other people that at least quietly believed in theistic evolution that would belong to the same organization. But it's not something you publicize if you do believe that. But it was because of my instability in my back and forth that they felt that I needed. They said that I was welcome to come back in maybe 4 or 5 years after if I had demonstrated stability for that long. But then I started reading Thomas Paine. Once they said, okay, you're no longer with us, that kind of released the dam, and I was able to read other things. I read Thomas Paine, The Age of Reason, Robert Ingersoll, a lot of essays written by Robert and speeches by Robert Ingersoll that just devastated my faith again. And perhaps, maybe it wasn't worth saving at that point, because I had already had those doubts, and there was no sense in trying to prop it up if it just didn't make sense. So at that point, Thomas Paine influenced me heavily, and I became a deist for about a year. So I believed that God created the universe, but didn't have a particular holy book or a particular exclusive faith that people had to subscribe to. He was more interested in people, living a moral life and that sort of thing. So, but Robert Ingersoll kind of, about a year later, after I was a deist, I ran into Robert Ingersoll, and that kind of put the kibosh on my theistic faith. Just the whole problem of suffering. I don't call it the problem of evil, because Christians tend to do a jujitsu on you, and you say, well, where did how do you know what's evil? You only know it's evil because there's good, and there's only good because there's God, that sort of jujitsu. It's like, no, I'm talking about the problem of suffering. The Bible, if you look throughout the Old Testament, especially, it talks about God. God is loving toward all He has made, and it provides sustenance in their time of need, and so forth. So there's these promises that are given, especially in the Old Testament, about not just humans but animals, providing for needs, and I can see that love demonstrate.
We're going to be out of time fairly quickly, so I want to get through, skip forward a little bit. What did you do for a career at this point? As you know, being a missionary and being in the pastorate is the only thing you'd ever trained for.
Yeah, so and that gets back to my mother's prescient recommendation to study computer science, which I had college.
Okay.
And so then I was able to fall back on that. I found a job here in the Dallas area, and so the rest is history. So and I've stayed with my wife. She's we have a very strong relationship. I love her. She loves me. We just don't talk about Christianity or religion, and it works best that way. And I go to church with her sometimes, and she'll pray before meals, and I'm respectful. And so I think our kids have, with 3 kids, and at least one of them is a believer, and the other 2, I don't think they are. So, but it's not something we dwell on. It's we tiptoe around it, and we make it work.
Now, how long have you been an atheist?
So that's a point of clarification. When I left deism, that would have been that was 2001.
Mm-hmm.
And I went into I kind of adopted a form of agnosticism.
Mm-hmm.
I would call it atheist-leaning agnosticism,
Mm-hmm.
and that's kind of where I've been ever since. Maybe I'm a chicken, maybe I waffle too much, but I have a hard time using the word atheist outright.
Okay.
I don't feel confident to say that. I know the definition of atheism has different definitions of atheism. Is it somebody who lacks belief in God, or is it somebody who disbelieves in God? I would say I at least lack a belief in God, but I'm not sure. There might be some force or deistic God out there. And there's a lot of questions. I've belonged to this Atheist and Christian book club. You've mentioned that channel before,
which is where I met you.
Right, yes. I think it would be a mistake for non-believers to think that theists have no good arguments. You read some of these authors, some of these professors, some of these philosophers that write books about necessity and logic and fine-tuning and those sorts of things, that some very respectable people that are out there, that Oxford trained people, for example, that it's always been a mystery to me how intelligent people can believe such wildly different things, but yet it happens. And it's partly a reflection of the fact that these are difficult questions that are hard to figure out. And who are we as humans to think that we know all the answers? So I've learned a little bit of humility even since the time I wrote the book. I think when I wrote the book, I was a little more. I don't think I was strident, but maybe I've softened a little bit since then. I'm still very much an atheist-leaning agnostic, but I have respect for those who have different positions, especially if they're not an independent fundamental Baptist. Now, those I have a hard time having respect for. But
are your parents still around?
My mother passed away in '98. My father he's 93, still living.
How does he feel about where you are in your faith, or lack thereof?
Oh, good question. That has been full of stress.
Okay.
And so there were times when we almost came. I wouldn't say literally came to blows, but verbally, we came to blows. But that was the worst of it. Happened maybe 5 to 7 years ago. And since then, I called for a détente. I said, "Look, Dad, I love you. I know you're concerned about me. You're more concerned about me than I am about you. It's kind of, it's asymmetrical, yes, but I just can't have a relationship with you. We're just going to fight all the time. I want to have a relationship with you. So let's not talk about this anymore." So.
I would say if God was as concerned about my salvation as you are, I would expect it to be God here talking to me about it than you.
Yeah, I mean, just like he came to Paul. That is a good point that you've been making in your speeches. But yeah, the hatred
Mhm.
of God, that's a very tough problem. It's almost as if even if God exists, we live in a world that appears to be as if he didn't.
Mhm.
There's a lot of questions about, well, how did we get started? How did this world get started? And how do we get to be the way we are? If you set those aside and you're just looking at the way the world is such that if you took God out of it, it wouldn't be any different. And that to me makes it most revealing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you said you still go to church about once a month. Do the people at your wife's church know that you are not a believer?
Most of them do. I go to a Sunday school with her when we go, and I usually button my lips. When there's only been one time, and it wasn't too long ago, and they were talking about the problem of Jesus' return, and you know, well, Jesus promised to come back before the people living in his era, in his generation, had passed away. They said, "Oh,
Mhm.
well, that's the transfiguration he was talking about." It's like, well,
Oh,
I just couldn't let that kind of slide because there were parallel passages that very much um, make that a non-starter. So I pointed out, I raised my hand and said, "Hey, well, what about this other parallel passage where it says this?" And there's no, it's clearly the transfiguration could not have been in view in that, because it was talking about bringing the angels will come and judge each man according to his deeds, that sort of thing. That didn't happen in the transfiguration, and yet that was also to happen in that generation. So yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to button up I tend to be I don't like to be confrontational or contentious,
mhm.
but every now and then I can't help myself.
I had somebody once ask me what it would take to get me to come to church. They put up a church sign. They said, "What would this sign have to say for you to come?" And I said, "Ridicule, welcome." If they said that, then I would.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So,
Does your
go ahead.
wife still work in a Christian field?
Uh, she was working as she taught English to refugees for 8 years until last year. That was a secular organization, but then that organization folded. And then she found a job actually with our old organization as an employee. And so now she's back with Wycliffe Bible Translators / SIL, working for them as an office manager. So, yeah, it's interesting.
And they're okay with her having an unbelieving husband.
She told them up front in the interview, and I think that probably gave her a leg
Seal
up,
the
to
deal?
be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I have a funny story for you that's a little bit like what you were saying, being a unbeliever in a church is my son lost his faith at his senior year of high school, and
Uh-huh.
he was attending a Christian high school. And we considered the possibility of moving him to a public school. However, his best friend was transgender, and his friend would be completely alone at that school if
Uh,
my son left. So he remained there, to support his friend. But one day in Bible class, they were talking about the red tent
uh,
and what the women had to do, if they were on their period.
uh,
And without thinking, my son said, "That is so stupid." And everyone in the class just gasped. How dare you say the Bible is stupid?
yeah. Well, good for him for, sometimes it's not always the most important thing to press what you believe. It's more important to have relationships. It's
Mhm,
a fine line between the two. And I'm
mhm,
still learning to kind of navigate that line. Um, but I wrote the book primarily because I was getting so many questions that, "Hey, what about this, Ken? What have you thought about this? Have you thought about that?" 9 times out
mm,
of 10, yes, I had thought about it, given a lot of thought about it. And I
mhm.
was finding myself having to defend myself over and over the same things. And so I thought, okay, well, why don't I just write this all down, and then I can just hand the book to whoever's asking. I can just hand it to them. And so that's why I wrote the book. So it's the first third of it is autobiographical.
Mhm,
Basically, a lot of the stuff that I've shared with you here is in that. But then the remainder of the book is taking one topic at a time, and each topic is related to something that caused me to believe before.
mm,
That's why
mhm,
the title is "Why I Believed." Um,
mhm.
so I lay out all the arguments that I adhered to, or all the reasons why I believed when I did believe, and then I examine them critically, based on all the thinking and the reading that I had done leading up to that, and kind of laying out both the kind of the reasons why people think those are attractive reasons to believe, and then also kind of dismantling those reasons. That's kind of the approach I took, why I believed.
That sounds absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I was just talking with somebody who read it recently, and they were saying that this is one of the more comprehensive books that he's ever read about Christianity and why one should reconsider one's commitment to Christianity. And I try to be gentle throughout. I'm not a bombastic writer. Thomas Paine influenced me. He was bombastic. Uh, there were several other, Ingersoll and even Dawkins. Somewhat they're known as being strident, but I set out to write it to people that I knew that I wanted to read it. I didn't want them to be turned off, so I wrote it very gently, without compromising my convictions and why it is exactly that I left the faith.
When
So,
you left the faith, did you lose friends?
um, well, we were in transition from Africa to the
Mm,
U.S. So yes, there were some, and some wrote me, and then church supporters and such, and some of them very nasty, and some I included some of those letters
mm.
in my book. Um, but for the most part, I was surprised by how kind and gentle people were to me, and I expected more opposition, more um, kind of pushback. But I
Mhm.
think honestly, people don't. Most people in the church aren't either prepared with the knowledge to kind of come back at you, or they just feel like it's not worth severing the relationship to try to confront you more strongly. So, apart from a few contentious conversations with my dad, and some online communication with people that severed some ties, it was mostly amicable, I would say.
Okay.
But
How
I do miss the tight knit fellowship that I used to have. That's the huge downside of coming out the other end, is that
Mhm.
cocoon that you were in is really kind of a support system. Um, so that is a huge downside.
How are your kids with dealing with being in a home that's half and half?
I think it's been a challenge for them. I think my daughter, especially, I mean, it goes into politics too, right? Because this is
Mhm.
politics has become, I think, a bigger thing than religion in the last 5 years or 8 years or whatever. Um, and so my daughter is a believer, but she's more of a moderate type believer and not politically conservative. And so she says, "How am I going to find a husband who meets all these criteria?" It's like, there's nobody. By now everybody's been sorted out between the right wing and right wing conservative Christian, and then
Tell her
moderate.
not to give up. My husband is one. He's a believer, but he's politically liberal.
Right. Well, recently, happy to say that she has found somebody who meets more or less that.
Oh, that's cool.
She's dating seriously, so we'll see what comes of it. But
Mhm.
yeah. The other two guys, I mean, I think they struggled some as well, but I think that they've most recently got married, so it's all good so far.
Okay. Very
Yeah.
good. Well, we are out of time, and I would like to let you plug your book one more time before we end the stream.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining. The I I didn't want to make any money off of it, so I'm selling for the least amount possible. And Amazon, that's $8.65 for the hard copy. So I get zero commission out of that, zero royalty. For the Kindle, the lowest that they would let me sell it for is 99 cents. So I sell it at 99 cents, and I get like a 35-cent cut, and I give that to charity. So I'm not going to make. If you're a Christian watching this show and you're worried that I'm going to take that money and use it to evangelize against or counter evangelize, then that's not a concern. I'm not making any money off of that. So, but again, it is a if you go into the Amazon site and read the reviews, you're going to see. I just read the AI summary. It's like most people find that I'm the most non-confrontational, the kindest, and the most comprehensive, treatment of Christianity that they've read. So,
Another friendly atheist.
yes,
Mhm.
yes.
Okay.
So,
Next week, my guest on the show is going to be Brady Blevins, another person that I met at the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Brady is a believer. And so the stream next week is going to be quite different. And so at this point, I want to thank everyone for coming. Oh, wait, I've got one question that I've been holding almost since the beginning of the show that and it was from Godless Yuri, who asked, what's the difference between a human with a soul and a human without a soul? How could you even tell? I'm not aware of having one myself.
is that for me or for you to answer?
That's for you, because you were mentioning that as a believer, you came to a theology that the humans before Adam and Eve had no souls.
Oh, yeah. Soul is a very, as far as I understand, it's more of a religious concept. If you're a materialist or a human, an atheist, maybe you can talk about the psyche, but the soul is not real. The soul is a religious term. So I wouldn't, as a non-believer myself, I don't subscribe to the concept of a soul. But back then, it was like a soul was something that God ordained, the spark, the kind of that divine, like in being created in the image of God. That's how I would define soul, whatever that means.
Okay. Okay, and with that, thank you all for your comments and your questions. And once again, this stream has been in memory of Von Rick Soulstrider, and Von Rick, you will be sorely missed. Thank you so much, Ken, for coming. It's been a pleasure having you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Live your life.
Sure.